Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name's Scott Dwyer. I'm the Executive Director for Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York and its Francis Tavern Museum. I want to welcome you all to another special Liberty 250 lecture with Francis Tavern Museum. We are commemorating the 250th anniversaries of events in our nation's founding. And of course, the Battle of Bunker Hill is one of those major events. Our kickoff to Liberty 250 included the opening of our special exhibition, Path to Liberty, The Emergence of a Nation, commemorating the United States semi-quincentennial. It is a chronological multi-year exhibition telling the history of the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783, with a distinctive focus on what occurred in New York and the surrounding areas. We'd like to give special thanks to the lead sponsors of our 250th exhibition, Peter C. Hine and Ann Farley, William Hale Kirby, Mrs. Stanley DeForest Scott, and Stephen T. Whalen. We would also like to thank the sponsors for this specific Liberty 250 evening lecture this evening, William S. Eakins, Peter C. Hine, and Peter J.W. Sherwin. For those joining us virtually, if you have any questions during the lecture, please leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your questions to the end. And of course, if you're joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. As always, please note the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution, the state of New York, or its Francis Tavern Museum. With that, I turn the podium over to our current president, Peter J.W. Sherwin.
Great, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you. You know what we are in the middle of? The semi-quincentennial. You know, it's really great. Last time I was up here was in connection with the 250th anniversary of the alarms on Lexington and Concord that, of course, occurred on April 19, 1775. And, you know, I was thinking about it, you know, when I was a kid, I learned about the alarms, but Bunker Hill, I mean, Bunker Hill was the big one. That's the one that, you know, you talk to your family about, your friends about, and of course, the 250th of the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, we could talk about it, give it lots of different names, was just last Tuesday. But we get together on Mondays, so we're gonna observe it now. But it's really exciting, and we're really so excited to have Dr. Samuel Forman with us tonight, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I introduce him and you get to hear his lecture and presentation, I wanted to thank some people because all of this does not happen just on a whim. I want to thank many of the people from our staff who were involved in this. Shelby Newhouser, who's the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York's membership manager. Melissa Lauer, there's Melissa right there. Thank you very much. Education and Public Programming Manager. Armini Wilkins, you saw Armini earlier. She's our Program and Events Associate. And of course, Scott Dwyer, you saw just a second ago, who's our Executive Director. I want to thank and recognize a number of our officers and members of the board who are with us here tonight. We've got past presidents Peter Hine, and let's see, did Ambrose Richardson? Oh, there's Bob McKay. Thank you very much. And Ambrose Richardson may be around still. Also, we've got our secretary, Justin Tessier, our registrar, Scott Jeffrey, and some members of our board, Alan Borst, Alex Pappas, Steve Madsen, and Russell Moore. Did I get everybody? There we go. And our Long Room Association. So treasurer, is Mark Kapinski here? No, Debbie Kopinski is, but you've stolen my thunder. I'm going to talk about Debbie in just a second. But Mark is, didn't want to leave the air conditioning of his apartment. Our long room association, though, is very important. We're very famous here at Francis Tavern for our long room, where, of course, General George Washington bid farewell to his officers on December 4, 1783. And we've got a supportive foundation, a little organization called Long Room Associates. And it's very important. So I want to recognize Bob McKay, Scott Jeffrey, and Peter Hine as among the members, and they're present tonight. Others, Debbie Kopinski, Ann Farley, and Sarah Giordano, who are with the Mary Washington Colonial Chapter of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Debbie is past regent, and Ann and Sarah are board members. I also want to recognize, again, his name has been mentioned a little bit, but Peter Hine. These events are really the brainchild of immediate past President Peter Hine, and he's been amazing in getting excellent lecturers and pulling this all together. He's chair of our 250th anniversary commemoration committee. And one more before we get to Dr. Sam, I want to note Robert Blecker is with us tonight. He is the author of the play Founder Anonymous, which is a play about Dr. Joseph Warren. You're going to hear more about him tonight, things you didn't already know. But his play is currently running off Broadway, not too far off Broadway. It's on 45th Street at the AMT Theater. And it opened earlier this month and it's running until July 2. I've been hearing really good things about it. And so everybody's encouraged to go if you're able. And now, Sam Forman. Sam is an historian of early American history. He's also on the Harvard University faculty and is a physician. That's why he gets to be called doctor. And throughout his successful careers as a physician, a military officer, and a businessman, he's published and lectured on historical topics that inform current issues and events of today. And I'm really excited to stop speaking and hear what Sam has to say. Please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. I'm really happy to be here and see such an enthusiastic and full house. And I understand there are additional folks tuned in remotely, probably a larger audience than is here physically. So what we're going to talk about today is a commemoration of the Battle of Bunker Hill and some details about it, but also Dr. Joseph Warren, whose contributions are intimately connected with the events leading up to the Revolutionary War through the Battle of Bunker Hill. So with that, let me tell you what we're going to do today, just an overview, and we'll see how well I'm able to do this in 45 minutes. You will have 15 minutes to have at me with questions afterwards. So we're going to talk about Joseph Warren and a stirring, inclusive vision for America, and the many roles he played in his scant lifetime. He barely turned 34 before he left the scene. And in that time was an influential member of the Sons of Liberty, president of Massachusetts Provincial Congress, key member of the Boston Tea Party, acknowledged author of the Suffolk Resolves, Masonic Grand Master, and many of the brethren in the room know some of the story behind that and the complexity of it, which I'm just going to gloss over for the many other things that he's involved with. He was also a humanitarian, physician of Boston's poor, and he was a key figure in not only the actions leading up to the revolution, but I think more importantly, the ideology that has become the American experience. Let me situate this in a timeline. A lot of this, I guess, is better known from the Boston area where I come from. I was born and raised in Philadelphia. Some of this timeline is known down there as well. But just for folks who may not be quite as well informed as the vast majority of the people in this room, I'll just go through a timeline. So we're going to talk about events that occurred approximately from about 1764 to 1775, and then beyond 1775, how those events were remembered or are remembered. So we have a crisis with the North American colonies in defining the relationship with the British colonial overseers. And key events include the Stamp Act and colonial resistance and riots around that, Townshend duties, Boston Massacre, as the British attempted to continue to assert their rights to tax Americans and to appoint colonial officials, and other key actions, and actually occupied Boston. Boston and Massachusetts in these early days leading to the Revolution was on point for many of the disputes between the colonies and Great Britain. Of course, there are a lot of actions going on in New York and Philadelphia, but some of the key events and the eventual outbreak of war actually put Boston on point, and some of its key personalities, like Warren. The destruction of the tea, known as the Boston Tea Party, was an assertion of American rights, which turned out to have backfired in the intolerable acts as the British overseers sought to shut down and reduce colonial assertion of autonomy within the British Empire. Joseph Warren was on point with his fellow Sons of Liberty, and a key document defining resistance to those intolerant acts were the Solemn League and Covenant. I'll talk more about that in some detail, and his role in it, and how that tied into the First Continental Congress and became actionable policies of the coordinated colonies. He was never at the Continental Congresses. Other more famous patriots were. However, he was key person in charge back in Massachusetts when many of these iconic events played out. In Massachusetts, 1774 and 1775, he had multiple roles and hats on as the President Pro Tem, Provincial Congresses, Committee of Safety, Donations and Supplies, which in effect were an increasingly revolutionary government, though not yet declared, in Massachusetts, facing down the occupying British Army. Okay, so let's roll up our sleeves and get into it. Other points situating on our timeline is the actual outbreak of war and Joseph Warren's role in that, in the causal chain of the war, and then his activities at Bunker Hill leading up to it. Just to end on the timeline, I won't get into in great detail, but the British were forced to evacuate Boston after a 9 to 10 month siege, and the war came to New York by the summer of 1776. I will not go into that, but this precedes all of that. So let's talk about Warren and him growing up and how did he become such an influential person. So he started out as the eldest of 4 sons on a yeoman farm in Roxbury, which is a small market town outside of Boston. Boston at that time had a population of around 15,000, which would have put it on a par, or perhaps behind New York. Philadelphia was the largest city in North America in the British colonies at the time. So this is a market town of about a population of 500, and they got a small farm, 4 boys. are the Warren children, and he's the eldest. The farm already made its mark in a small kind of way through the cultivation of the first distinctly American apple strain, the Warren or Roxbury russets. And they were cultivated probably in a previous generation or two on the Warren farm, which was there since the late 17th century. I'll just say a couple of things about the Warren russet because I like apples. So the russeting is like a bumpy surface. This has more in common with a Maine potato in appearance than it does with a crispy apple. And the apples really weren't primarily used for eating as snacks. They were used for everything else. And in commerce, they were traded as apples to plantations in the Caribbean. They were made into apple butter. And in the case of a Warren russet, which was probably a big part of its popularity, it had a very high sugar content. And you could easily brew up hard cider with a alcohol content of 7-8%, 18 proof. It makes the stuff served down in the France's restaurant look wussy. No offense needed, but I mean, that's true, I think, of all commercial apple ciders now. So it had a very high alcohol content, which was easy to achieve. Also, it matured late in the fall. So it being ripening late in October, first frost, they say, that you could easily, put it down the cellar and keep it all winter. But that late ripening posed a potential hazard. And apparently Joseph Warren's father was involved in harvesting apples in the first frost in late October of 1755, reached out on a limb, slipped, fell down, and broke his neck. He did not die immediately, say the sparse accounts at the time, but his youngest son, John Warren, who was less than 3 years old, was able to attend to Dad in his death throes. You can imagine what kind of impact it would have had on the young child. This threw the Warren family into crisis in that Joseph Warren's mother, Mary Stevens Warren, was now a widow and with 4 kids and an active farm. What was she to do? She was actually quite the woman and resourceful. And despite this setback, she was able to keep the farm going with some help of folks in the church and local citizens. And they were very well situated in the community and could call on that kind of support. And she also mortgaged the farm in order to pay Joseph's tuition to go to Harvard. So despite the setback, Joseph was able to go to Harvard and study there. Joseph Warren was active in the farm. His political opponents made fun of him in later years as a bare-legged milk boy hawking milk to the market in Boston. He and people like him were probably very proud of being working yeomen, but the kind of people like Peter Oliver and these well-connected and rich loyalists were actually deriding him and making fun of him. He graduated in Harvard, class of 1759. While he was there, he probably participated in the militia. There's a number of records that were destroyed in a fire from that time frame. So it's a little sketchy. But one of the things that of note was that Warren apparently had a flair for the dramatic. He liked plays. He's known to have mounted a play in his dorm room. The play was Addison's play Cato, which was very famous in the 18th century and less so as a play popularizing ideology associated with the Whigs in England. That is social contract of the governed with the government, intrinsic rights of the people, Carter rights, and that sort of thing, in the context of dramatizing Cato, who was a Roman Republican senator known to be opposing the increasing dictatorial nature of Julius Caesar. And that's what the play is about Cato trying to lead resistance, ultimately futilely, against a dictatorially leaning government. In the play, we don't know if Joseph played the lead role of Cato, but its dramatic end, at least the words of it may be familiar to you. Cato gives up, and instead of giving up to the encroachments on government of Julius Caesar, he chooses to commit suicide. And he says in the play that he regrets that he has but one life to give for his country. That's usually associated with Nathan Hale, a spy who was captured in New York and executed here. He was probably quoting Cato. And given some of the events in Joseph Warren's life, you wonder how much he internalized that. Joseph Warren joined St. Andrew's Lodge of Masons in 1761. There he befriended Paul Revere, who was already a member, and also John Hancock, who apparently was slumming. He was one of the richest people, perhaps the richest merchant in Massachusetts and in the Boston sphere. He would have more naturally been a member of the more established lodge, whose majority membership were loyalists and Tories. But he chose the newer lodge, the upstarts, the Scottish Rite Ancients, which is a division within Masonry at that time, and became a leader of St. Andrew's Lodge, and they became fast friends that way. Medically, Joseph Warren apprenticed to a prominent physician, Dr. James Lloyd, in the early 1760s. Now, there were 3 ways to become a physician in those days. Do you all know the 3 ways? Okay, I'll tell you. Number 1 is you get mommy and daddy to send you to a prestigious medical school in Europe, because there weren't very many choices in North America. There was this newfangled College of Pennsylvania founded in 1759, but that wasn't much known in New England. There was King's College, had a medical school from about 1767 here in New York. That's now Columbia, and that was it. So the preferred route was to go to London or Edinburgh or Leiden or Paris, if you had the linguistics, to become a physician and then come back. The second way was to apprentice yourself to a physician that had that background. That is what Joseph Warren was able to do. Physicians with that background had the choice of ambitious young men who wanted to be physicians. The third way, and I want libertarians here to take note, the third way was to put out a shingle saying, I am a physician. And if the patients came, that's the proof of it. Dr. Thomas Young, whom some of you may know as one of the Boston Sons of Liberty, and not so known except for he named the state of Vermont and some other things. He was one of those physicians. And I go into it in the book, I won't here, but Joseph Warren went after Thomas Young as being a quack and a mountebank in the press. And it is very amusing. You would not want to be on the wrong side of Joseph Warren. They reconciled. Some of my research took me into the account books of Joseph Warren, in that Warren played out most of his life, including his political life, with associates in Boston. And there really wasn't much reason to write letters, except if they were separated. Some of the letters exist with Samuel Adams, but while Samuel Adams was in Boston, there wouldn't be any reason to write things down. Joseph was not the kind of person to keep a diary. And so we don't have that. Like we have John Adams and some others that meticulously documented their own lives in their own way. We don't have that for Joseph Warren. So the vast majority, just so far as volume of materials that he left, are his account books, which are basically financial documents in abbreviations for a practice so arcane that hardly anybody can make heads or tails out of. But I could. So at any rate, I transcribed the account books, and through patients identified, many of whom have left documents, diaries, letters, you could piece together his personal associations and make some inferences in a way that I don't think people could do before. It's like looking at the Revolutionary era through the keyhole of his medical office. So he begins private practice in the North End of Boston, 1763. I mean, if you were a physician and you had to pick a location that was on the point of the greatest issue within the British Empire, like that's where it would be. Now, he didn't do that deliberately. It just kind of ended up that way. But that's where he started his practice. And as a young physician, and he's born in 1741, so he's like in his early 20s. There is a smallpox outbreak in Boston, and he becomes a key person in working to get the established physicians together. Mind you, there's no Department of Public Health or any government agency. These are the physicians like voluntarily getting together to mount an inoculation campaign against smallpox, and to coordinate that with the civil authorities of the town of Boston. So they mount a major inoculation campaign. Inoculation in those days, this is not immunization, if there are some doctors or nurses in the audience, where you take cowpox and you scratch it into someone and induce a disease that's not as severe. That's 1798. That's a generation after. This is inoculation. You take someone with smallpox, get their pustule, take the pus and inoculate it in somebody that hasn't had it. It's controlled in smallpox, and the people who were given smallpox in those ways were separated from the community in temporary smallpox hospitals. Joseph Warren was the house physician in one of those. Miraculously, nobody in Joseph Warren's smallpox facility died. And the campaign was a success in the sense, and the newspapers and churches were keeping records of this. So we even have statistics on this. If you were inoculated in this campaign, you had a 1/20th chance of dying compared to if you refused to be inoculated and caught smallpox wild. So it's very successful. It was quite successful for the time. At the same time, though, he also became interested in politics, and he was writing op-ed pieces for the leading newspaper in Boston under pseudonyms. Philo Physique, that's as a physician. Pascalos, a true patriot. That last one landed his publisher into trouble with the colonial government over freedom of speech. Sons of Liberty, some of these associates in St. Andrew's Lodge and elsewhere were leading patriots of the Whig cause in America. There's John Hancock on the left, Paul Revere center, Sam Adams on the right. These are wonderful portraits by John Singleton Copley. He was probably recruited into the Sons of Liberty in the late 1760s, likely by Samuel Adams himself. The Boston Massacre was a major event that occurred in 1770. Joseph Warren had some role in the official description of that and in the autopsy of a child who was shot about 2 weeks before. So one of the things that the Boston Patriots did was to keep alive the memory of the Boston Massacre and to build on it the rationale for the approach to government and rights and taxation that they were advocating. I think Samuel Adams is famously quoted as, keep your opponents in the wrong and keep them there. So the idea that there was this massacre was something that you are going to hold that memory over your opponents and recall it every year, but use that recollection not only to keep alive the resentment over where some of these British colonial policies could go into a murderous direction, but also to set a vision for how to do it better and what government should look like in the relationship between the government and the governed. Joseph Warren had a bombastic way of speaking. He could enunciate an issue succinctly, colorly. I say bombastic, probably by even standards at the time, he could be kind of over the top, but in a very engaging kind of way. And he could describe these issues, but also take it down to individual people. What are you going to do about it? And very naturally did that. That came natural to him. And some of these massacre orations that come down to us are particularly effective in that way. I took some quotes here that give you a feel for his wording and how he would approach issues. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Well, maybe I should for the remote audience. None but they who set a just value upon the blessings of liberty are worthy to enjoy her. If you from your souls despise the most gaudy dress that slavery can wear, if you really prefer the lonely college, et cetera, our enemies will hide their heads in confusion, shame, and despair. The choice of words is often about chattel slavery. But Joseph Warren himself had never left any written view of enslaved Black African Americans. But the language that he uses and his fellow patriots are cast in the language and concepts of chattel slavery. The destruction of the tea was a piece of political theater that the Boston Patriots staged when tea was being forced onto the American market in a monopolistic kind of way. Folks in New York, I guess, and some Philadelphia were a little bit more civilized than that. Even Governor Tryon, I guess the loyalist governor, said, okay, this is too controversial with our local Sons of Liberty, just send the tea back to Great Britain. Boston, no. Throw it in the water. Now, they tried every which way through open meetings to negotiate with the governor and with the tea consignees to not land the tea and basically not have to pay the tax. So far as a policy of the British, it was really quite clever because the taxed tea, even with the tax, cost more than the smuggled tea that patriots were often using. So, I mean, they really could not let this tea land because once it got into the colonial market, it would sell better than the other alternative. So at any rate, Joseph Warren played some key role in the Tea Party. It's not well documented, but his fingerprints are all over it, as the St. Andrew's Lodge members are. The British reaction was the intolerable acts. Instead of backing down in whole or in part, as they did after the Stamp Act in 1765, they redoubled their efforts. They closed the port of Boston. They made the governor general send up Thomas Gage from New York to act as governor. It's like a military governor. courts would no longer try people locally, but at a distance. Those were examples of the intolerable acts. So the question was, how will Boston resist? The Suffolk Resolves were resolves put together from the towns around Boston, including Boston, as to how they were going to oppose the British. Now, by then, the First Continental Congress was being organized in Philadelphia, and some of the key patriots that we know were on their way to Philadelphia or in Philadelphia. But Joseph Warren was the leading patriot in charge. So he was, in his first elected office, overseeing the Suffolk Convention. So we have a draft, the first draft of it, which does not have the fingerprints of Joseph Warren, and it has pretty much what you would expect to have so far as the principles of the patriots being expressed and the suggestion of very muscular boycotts to oppose it. When Joseph Warren rewrites it, it's different. It has the same teeth to it, actually even more, and it is written in just beautiful prose that is very rousing. But for all of that, the resolves are very specific and actionable. This also is very Joseph Warren. I'm not going to get into the details except one. Number 19. If our enemies by sudden maneuvers render it necessary for us to ask for aid and assistance of our brethren in the country, some one of the committee of correspondence shall dispatch couriers with written messages to the selectmen or committees of correspondence, several towns in the vicinity, until proper and sufficient assistance be obtained. This is like a blueprint for what transpired in April of 1775. So what about the Suffolk Resolves? They were delivered by Paul Revere in probably his most long distance, if not his most famous ride, and were adopted word for word by the First Continental Congress as their work product. So what were the resolves of Boston and his town now become the resolves of the Continental Congress. This could be considered a founding document of the United States. If the original ever is found, it probably should be in the Library of Congress next to the Declaration of Independence. He got to do a massacre commemorative oration in 1775. This one was even more controversial for 1772 because the British had reoccupied Boston. And the word was out that if Joseph Warren was to say anything of a treasonous nature, British soldiers who were invited to hear him by Samuel Adams, so they keep an eye on him, were to arrest Joseph Warren on the spot, or worse, run him through with swords. That did not dissuade Joseph Warren. In fact, there's a credible story that one of the British soldiers was threatening Joseph Warren with a handful of musket balls that he was just showing and rolling them around. So Joseph Warren, newly onto the podium, just pulled out a white handkerchief and let it drop on the musket balls and just kept on in a kind of a demonstration of ultimately peaceful intent. And he continued. Memorable words from the oration. I don't think I have time to go through them. But he did not have kind words for a kind of colonial imperialism. How religion could be used by Tories and political opponents to try to force compliance with unacceptable policies. And to encourage resistance, even in the face of the most powerful colonial power in the world at that time. Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends determined to be free. And heaven and earth will aid the resolution. And now he takes it home to the individuals and what they must do. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important questions on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. He was talking in the moment of that current crisis, but it's seemingly like he was speaking to future Americans as well. And he may well have been doing this consciously. So what about Joseph Warren's practice? He's still a practicing physician, early April, 1775. Here's his account book. It's looking pretty disorganized by now. This is him and his associate, William Eustace, who was his medical student at the time. And they have some patients that are pretty weird for a financial document where you expect to collect fees for your services. Indian. Who's the Indian? Negro woman. How about this? Mr. Cattern. Mr. Cattern was interesting because instead of providing services to Mr. Cattern, he's paying Mr. Cattern half-pence coins by the bagful. Why? We don't know. A cook, soldier's wife. There's only one soldier anything in Boston at the time. That's British Army, soldier's child. Camp woman. Who is camp woman? There wasn't any American camp women at that time. So in this context, Joseph Warren, through what I guess we might call a spy network, discovered the British object as they were mobilizing on the evening of April 18th, 1775. He sends Paul Revere. He activates the militia under his membership in the Committee of Safety and him being president pro tem of the Provincial Congress. So he calls in Paul Revere, calls in William Dawes. He knows something about what the British are up to, sends them west of Boston to activate the Minutemen and the militia. Proximate act in the start of the American Revolution. Lanterns were a precaution. You know that. One by land, two by sea. Who was a camp woman? There is I guess, a romance that it was actually some kind of illicit affair between Joseph Warren and Margaret Kemble Gage. Certainly not true. I play with it in a book as clearly identified fiction, but it makes a good story that modern people like. Who was a real woman in Joseph Warren's life? Miss Mercy Scully, his unofficial fiance at the eve of the Revolutionary War. He was a widower at that point. He had been widowed in 1773. He had 4 kids between 2 and 10 years old. Mercy Scully is a story of her own, but she was the fiance and she was sent off to Worcester with the children early in April 1775. What did Joseph Warren do on April 18th, 19? So he mobilizes the militia. He meets with the Committee of Safety. He gets out of Boston himself very early in the morning on April 19th, and he joins the fighting as the British are retreating from Lexington and Concord. And in so doing, he was so close to the fighting that the stylish hair roll that he had got shot off by a musket ball. And he's in the fighting and tending to the wounded at the same time, which even in the military then was an unusual kind of thing to do. He was not fazed by that. He just said, so what? I'll just continue doing what I'm doing. Then Joseph Warren, as the British have been chased into Boston, and it starts the siege of Boston as the Minutemen circle Boston and the British can't get out and the Americans don't have enough power to go in to the city. That is the start of the siege of Boston immediately after Lexington and Concord. However, Joseph Warren, and a previous biographer, has called the 100 days between the 1775 massacre and his passing at Bunker Hill as the 100 days of Joseph Warren. And I think it was very apt because the crisis in North America was on his shoulders more than anybody for 100 days. And his situational leadership during that time, truly impressive. I think he kept the American Revolution together at a key juncture, and he gave it his all. But here's some of the things that he did, and it was very specific. He's the one who ordered collection of the affidavits following the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He was going to get an account to England before the official British accounts sent by General Gage, and he did. So those affidavits were collected, and he hired a ship, the Quero, sailed to England, got there 2 weeks before General Gage's dispatches. So the story of Lexington and Concord was the Patriots' story of what happened, not some loyalist whitewash. That's him. He made it happen, but that wasn't the only things he was making happen. Negotiating with General Gage about the transit of refugees in both directions out of Boston, tease up the quest for the cannon of Ticonderoga. In the Committee of Safety, Benedict Arnold pitched the idea, and Joseph Warren, Benjamin Church of all people, were very much endorsed that to start the wheels turning. That is the eventual thing that broke the siege when Knox and Washington finally got those tons and tons of artillery to the Boston area to strategically force the British out. But the start of that was under Warren. Appeals to the Continental Congress to form a Continental Army. In all that, he's overseeing that there be qualified physicians and surgeons for the military. So he's advancing medicine and the standards. And he was personally grilling people who wanted to be regimental and hospital surgeons before he would let them do that in May of 1775. His own younger brother, John Warren, was one of them. Joseph Warren and the Committee of Safety in mid-June got intelligence, and there's a whole lot less interest on how he got this intelligence versus prior to Lexington and Concord, that the British were intending to fortify Dorchester Heights. The American militia generals, consulting with Warren, decided that they would fortify Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. This is the Charlestown Peninsula, city of Boston, that they would fortify Bunker Hill. They actually fortified Breed's Hill, apparently by mistake. And Joseph Warren, just a few days before, had been appointed a fighting major general. Warren apparently, even though he really was, I think, ultimately an advocate of a peaceful settlement through, deterrence of having the Patriots have a strong, credible militia, but I don't think he really wanted the Patriots to use that in a war. But he realized, I guess, early in the siege of Boston, that this contest was going to be settled militarily and not through diplomacy. So he decided that he wanted to be a fighting major general, not a doctor, but a fighting major general. He lobbied his colleagues in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and they decided to appoint him that approximately June 1775. They never got around to confirming the appointment. So that figures into what happened during the Battle of Bunker Hill. So Joseph Warren, who was afflicted by what we would call cluster headaches or migraines, apparently had one that morning. So he showed up at the battlefield late. The battle had already started. There's some side discussion that he might have run off to attend a patient, which would have been a pretty ill-advised thing to do at that particular time. But for the headache is the reason that that I think we should go with. He shows up late at the battlefield. He comes to the battlefield. He encounters, this is a 19th century engraving, so everybody has uniforms, which they didn't actually have any uniforms in June of 1775. Counters Israel Putnam, experienced French and Indian War general. And Putnam says, you know, Warren's the civilian on the right. I hear you've been appointed Major General. What are my orders? Battle's already started. So if Joseph Warren had been confirmed, he would have outranked everybody on the field. So Warren explained, and there was probably some colorful wording given what we know about Israel Putnam, that he was not there to fight as a major general, but rather to learn the art of war. Where will the fighting be the hottest? So Israel Putnam says, if you insist, Warren, go forward to this redoubt, this dirt fort that we had built overnight on Breed's Hill, which is closest to the British. And that's what he does. In the melee and the third and final assault on that fort, Joseph Warren was shot dead. The original, this is an iconic picture. It shows up in every history book. It's probably one of the earliest of the historical genre paintings of the Revolutionary Wars, painted by Trumbull in the early 1780s, based on his hundreds of yards distant eyewitness account and interviews and that sort of thing. The original title of this is The Death of Major General Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, June 17th, 1775. So what happened? What really happened there? There are about 12, as biographer, I tracked down about 12 wildly different accounts that some of them have Warren, you know, speaking patriotic speeches that go on for pages and pages. Other of them have him like shot randomly at the end of the battle. So what was true? You know, you take all the accounts together that he was shot, bayoneted, had his head chopped off, whatever. I think there's one biographer who does that. Or sort out what you can. So a descendant, kind of a wacky guy, John Collins Warren, was a nephew of Joseph Warren. In one of the numerous reburials of Joseph Warren, had pictures taken of Joseph Warren's skull in the 1850s. Pretty unlikely sounding. I've tracked down the provenance of these things. They're the real deal. I was able to do a forensic reconstruction of those old daguerreotypes on the upper left, which are probably some of the oldest forensic pictures taken anywhere in the world of anything. Unfortunately, the photographer did not put a scale in the picture, so it is what it is. I put an arrow towards a hole in the maxilla or cheekbone that isn't naturally there. And if you were looking at a skull, you do not see air out the back of the skull either. This is a massive wound of a circular projectile right through the base of Joseph Warren's head. You do not make speeches after a wound like that. You don't even breathe for more than a minute or two at most. Joseph Warren's body was retrieved after the siege of Boston, after having been thrown in a common grave by the British. And he was so decomposed that the only way they had a positive identification was some false teeth, which survive better than the real teeth, made apparently by Paul Revere. And those are Paul Revere's dental tools. And so how can this help us? Well, we can put a scale in the picture. The intraocular diameter is pretty standard stuff. Some plastic surgeons measured hundreds, thousands of Northern European skulls for these measurements to use in reconstruction of skulls. And we can determine that the caliber is 54 caliber plus or minus 4/100ths of an inch. That is a caliber associated with a British officer's weapon. One of the accounts says that Joseph Warren, at the end of the battle, when most Americans fled, was fending off the attack of several British regular soldiers. A British officer recognized him, may have attempted to take him prisoner, but the British officer's assistant, it's called a Batman, grabbed the officer's weapon and shot Joseph Warren down. And that soldier immediately, as they say, was cut to pieces. He got killed in the melee almost immediately. That seems to be the true account. In any case, poor Joseph was dead. So how is he remembered? Well, first of all, Mercy Scully remembered him because she was the unofficial mother to his 4 orphan children with no official standing. And there's a whole issue around that, which I'm not going to get into. But he was remembered even during the Revolutionary War in its immediate aftermath as a martyr to the cause. And I think he kind of still is. The woodcut on the left, 1775, a poem about Joseph Warren. That's the frontispiece. There is, this is actually one of my favorite, a woodcut from around 1781 of Joseph Warren. They already have him in a major general's uniform, which he never had, and that's the way he's remembered. And then on the right is from the early 1780s, apparently an unofficial knockoff of the Trumbull painting. But he's a martyr. So, all his contributions to ideology of American government, of his contributions to the siege of Boston and to keeping the proto-government running, all immediately before George Washington is appointed commander of the Continental Army, somehow gets lost. I think it's unfortunate. A true American. His last words, recorded by a friend the night before he died, was to quote one of these Latin poems of old, probably his Harvard erudition showing. Dulce et decorum est pro patria more, it's sweet and proper to die for one's country. So, current interest. There's some stuff going on right now. There is a play about Joseph Warren, Bunker Hill, playing off Broadway right now. I saw it. It's fantastic. It's very well researched and extremely entertaining. But there's some other stuff going on that is a deluxe reprint edition. Very many of you decided to take it. Thank you very much. That's the publisher tipping the hat to the Rev War 250 to have a beautiful edition. But then I ran into a censor from the People's Republic of China who wants to change this story. This is for real. I am not kidding. Let me tell you just a little bit about that. My publisher, Pelican and Arcadia, like a lot of publishers, farms out printing to overseas printers. They undercut American workers. They deliver beautiful editions for cheap. And it's been going on for decades. So my publisher had this arrangement with a publisher in Hong Kong, and all things were going to go very nice. But then I got a call from my publisher, this is late in last year, that the publisher had a request from a People's Republic of China censor that I should change parts of the book. And my publisher, he was puzzled. He had never gotten a question like this. And I had to say, help me understand this. This is a book that has been printed before by an American historian and author for an American audience. And you want to change it. So my publisher was flustered and said, well, the changes they want don't somehow seem to be central to the story. So why don't you take the easy path and just make the changes? So I thought about that. And one of the things I thought about was, what would Joseph Warren do? And I even told the publisher that. The publisher got some backbone after that. I said, no, hell no. This is our story. This is Joseph Warren. I'm going to tell it the way it is, the way it was, and I don't need any help on this from a foreign government who's not especially friendly to the United States at times. However, I may have encountered a soft diplomacy effort going on that this may be tip the iceberg. That's what I want to find out, because academic presses send things to be printed to China. A number of presses do. And these changes, if made, will not be obvious that they were made by a Chinese censor. They will look like stuff that I wrote. Kind of insidious, actually. So I went back and forth and got the documentation of what the changes the Chinese censors wanted. So I have two chapters, which are really historiographic. One of them is why Joseph Warren was famous and why isn't he famous so much anymore? And that's of interest. Another one was international comparisons, comparing the early revolutionary experience, aspiring to representative government, orderly process, a government of laws, of Congresses overseeing the executive and accountable through, you name all the issues that were current then and some still current now. And I contrast that to Joseph Warren's story, to some early revolutionary experiences. For instance, Joseph Warren confronted a mob in the powder alarm, September of 1774. Didn't have time to talk about that. But his aim, he reduced the tensions. This mob, if it were in 1789 in Paris, would have opponents' heads on pikes. Not with Joseph Warren. He thrillingly, and he was just overjoyed to do this, was able to get through a bloodthirsty crowd of thousands and reduce the tensions, and to actually come to a reasonable outcome at that time. Have the Tory mandamus councilors renounce their offices and not be assassinated or something, like some in the audience probably wanted to do. What would Napoleon have done in that kind of scenario? You know, I'm in charge. What would Mao Zedong have done and did do in certain early key episodes of the Chinese Revolution? So I have an international comparisons type thing. I mentioned this kind of thing in passing. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, comparing some of these key personalities of how their actions at key junctures differ from this American experience. I'm kind of getting into American exceptionalism. Not exactly a sexy thing to do right now. I believe it. I suspect the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York do too. But at any rate, I got the censor to declare themselves. What were they upset about and what did they want to change? All my references to Russia and anybody, it was China. And I made some reference to violence associated with Mao Zedong, and they wanted that expunged. So when their view, one could back into, is we could think what we want about Joseph Warren, but don't you dare think that it's different and maybe aspirationally a better way than their history. This is right now. So there's nothing to see here. There's other things they could have glommed onto, but it was number one on the top. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. Joseph Warren's experience in Bunker Hill is still relevant 250 years after.
So I think we'll have time for just a few questions. We do have some people who are going to be going down to dinner, but I will start with one of our questions from Zoom before we take a few from the room. So I have a question from Stephen, which is how did they fortify Breed's Hill by mistake?
You know, military historians are still actively talking about that. Nathaniel Philbrick, in his wonderful recent book about Bunker Hill and Boston, siege of Boston, gets into that. And I would say that there's no one answer. There was apparently some misunderstanding of the orders of the Committee of Safety, like where was Bunker Hill? You know, like that, there was some level of disorganization which flustered the British. You know, they were perhaps expecting a more orderly opponent like they were, but you have these militia groups under the authority of the Committee of Safety, but not really answerable to them. Troops from Connecticut were wondering whether they should report in with the other troops from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, elsewhere, that kind of thing. So when the order came, there was some discussion on the field that it would be better to fortify on Breed's Hill. And it was night, and I guess, so when the sun came up and they saw how exposed they were to the British warships in the Mystic River right there, at least the common troops thought that it was a mistake, or maybe they were even betrayed to be that exposed. Meanwhile, Israel Putnam on the field, he was the ranking general on the field, was trying to get some order of this. And he was back on Bunker Hill trying to direct troops and stuff like that without much success. You know, troops were deserting. If there were a wounded one, 10 people would assist the wounded person when maybe only 1 or 2 would, to take them back from the front lines. And meanwhile, the most stalwart people continued to man this dirt fort, the Redoubt, which is built like overnight. And then, once the battle starts, then you've got mayhem. Got to recall that the musketry is black powder, clouds of smoke. Apparently, it was as hot as it is today on June 17, 1775. People are flinging off their coats and just mayhem. And then the Americans start to run out of ammunition after the subsequent assault. Eyewitness talks about just the musketry sputtering. It's just obvious that the Americans are running out of ammunition. Joseph Warren stays with a few other hardcore people, including African Americans, heroic people like Peter Salins standing side by side in the Redoubt. But why? Not really known.
Thank you, Sam. Very inspiring. So we've lost sight of our great hero, and we also lost sight of some of our great villains. That is, I wonder if you might say a word about Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Church and Joseph's relationship to both of those.
Okay, Benjamin Church was a son of liberty, pretty much unknown now, except to maybe some hardcore enthusiasts like are in the room. He was our first Surgeon General, but he was also our first traitor. He even beat Benedict Arnold to the punch. So he apparently was corresponding with General Gage's staff and revealing secrets. He was on the payroll. This was unsuspected by the Patriots. Paul Revere, 20 years later, said Joseph Warren suspected Benjamin Church. I don't think so. Church had them all going. And he was discovered almost coincidentally by some coded letters that were captured by an intermediary, and he was court-martialed just a few months later. But by that time, there was a Continental Army, and George Washington presided in person over the court-martial of Benjamin Church. This is circa October of 1775. So we've got a villain, a turncoat in the Sons of Liberty. Who's the other one you wanted to talk about?
Arnold, his relationship to this.
Yeah, Benedict Arnold would have met Joseph Warren at the committee safety, when Benedict Arnold had come up from Connecticut to pitch taking Fort Ticonderoga, amongst other reasons, and the most prominent reason, were these cannon up there were poorly defended, and the American nascent army during the siege of Boston sorely needed cannon and had virtually none, or very, very low caliber ones. So there would have been that interaction. Joseph Warren was a proponent of this idea and made sure that Benedict Arnold had some money and some gunpowder and stuff like that to do this. Benjamin Church was very much behind this as well. He was also sitting on the Committee of Safety. This is like late April 1775. And I don't think, Professor Blecker, that there's any documentation of that interaction, the nature of it. I believe Joseph Warren would have had the confidence that Benedict Arnold was pitching a good idea that should be backed up by the Massachusetts Provincial Congress with some real money and blessing. So there was that far, that much. Personal interactions, not recorded, unknown. All we have is this late recollection, which I think is 20/20 hindsight, of Paul Revere writing 20 years later, something to the effect that Joseph Warren didn't think much of Benjamin Church and perhaps thought he was suspicious.
I have 3 questions.
3. I'm not sure whether I could do all 3 because we may have some others.
Who was supposed to win? Who did win? And what were the reports of the day about who won?
Battle of Bunker Hill, you're saying. The British won in the traditional sense of winning the field. The Americans ran away. They were pushed off the Charlestown Peninsula, but the British were not able to exploit that victory anymore. So it was a Pyrrhic victory. Casualties, British around 1,100, about 200 dead. Americans, less than half that, 450 casualties and some dead amongst those. So a British Pyrrhic victory. It ties in to the outcome of Joseph Warren's posthumous life, in that he was killed on the field and the field belonged to the British. And the British did not think too much of Joseph Warren. So they just put him in a hasty grave, didn't mark it, and retrieving Joseph Warren's body after the siege of Boston concluded, evacuation day, March 17, 1775, was pressing for the Patriots to retrieve Joseph Warren's body and find out whatever insults the British may have done to it, which was the source of rumor. The British at the time, one of the generals on the field, I think it may have been Howe or Burgoyne, who were major leaders themselves, but at that time they were on Gage's staff, said that the death of Warren was worth 500 dead provincial soldiers, that they were impressed with that. Some may have also been disbelieving that the president of the Provincial Congress would have been right out there on the front line. It's rather foolhardy. Even the British were thinking twice about that. And it took some days for the Americans to realize that he was actually dead. He had been sighted in various places. So British victory, the Americans, a psychological victory. More importantly, strategically, Lexington and Concord, even after Lexington and Concord, there could have been a peaceful resolution if both sides were in a mode to do that. After Bunker Hill and the effusion of blood and the insult to the British Empire and its might to be not defeated, but to be handled thusly by a bunch of rabble, pretty much made the war the war.
So I'm going to end with one final question from Michael Bloom on Zoom. And he asks, if Dr. Warren had continued his path of crucial proactive contributions and leadership and survived, what do you think his long-term aspirations were, and what would his role have been going forward?
There's some fans, including some branches of the Warren family, who believe Joseph Warren would have been president and he would have outshone George Washington. I don't think that is the case. We're into the manner of speculative history, however, so you never really know. But let me put out three plausible scenarios. One is Joseph Warren survives the battle and he is a hero. He is on a list of notable Massachusetts people being recommended to George Washington to appoint to key roles on his assumption of the Continental Army, which he does in Cambridge in July of 2nd, 1775 in Cambridge. So Joseph Warren would have been, I think, appointed to some key role. Now, would George Washington have acceded to Joseph Warren's preference to be a fighting leader? I wonder about that. There were needs on the medical side, especially after Church was court-martialed just a few months later. I could see a conversation of Warren on the staff of George Washington after the battle, newly appointed as a Continental staffer, to this sort of father figure that he tended to have an attraction to throughout his life, saying, Joseph, the medical department is a mess. I know you want to be a fighting major general, but clean it up, will you? And he might have been the second Surgeon General and been responsible for establishing the medical department. Another plausible scenario is that Joseph, being somewhat impulsive, there's some examples of him being impulsive, would have had his appointment to be a fighting general or leader on the Continental staff granted, and put himself out in some skirmish or other and got himself killed promptly in some other scenario. I find that very plausible. Now, Joseph Warren, for all of his the speculations that you might have, people associated with him became major leaders. His medical protege, the Eustace, he goes on to be governor of Massachusetts, Secretary of War in the War of 1812. The John Warren, who attended the dying dad and was Joseph Warren's apprentice, founds the Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts Medical Society. John Hancock is a president of the Second Continental Congress, governor of Massachusetts, Sam Adams, governor, and everybody, Elbridge Gerry, some of these secondary characters who touch Joseph Warren seem to be energized by his charisma and go on to significant things. So perhaps he would have become president of the United States. Thank you, Mr. Blum, for that.
Thank you. Oh my. So it's not a silver trophy or anything like that, but it is a certificate of appreciation.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you very much. And Scott.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming here tonight, and thank you to Sam Forman for that excellent lecture. We really appreciate it. For all of you who enjoyed tonight's lecture and like to stay up to date on our programs, you can do so on either sonsoftherevolution.org or francistavernmuseum.org. You can also find our calendars of programs and symposiums. We'll be hosting together with Culture Now on July 3rd, 4th, and 5th, a great symposium celebrating Independence Day and 400 years of New York City. Thank you to those who donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us meet our mission to share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you'd like to donate, please visit francistavonmuseum.org. For those who would like a book signed by Dr. Forman, we have him available briefly after the meeting, after the event tonight, to sign your book if you haven't gotten it already. And for those attending the dinner this evening, please make your way immediately downstairs. We ask you to the Washington Room. You can do so at the back of the gallery using the elevator, or at the front of the museum through the stairs, and the restaurant staff will guide you there. Thank you again for joining us tonight online and in person, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.